Laszlo Krasznahorkai has just won the Nobel Prize in Literature, so I thought it would be fun to talk about what I find interesting about his style. I just finished his most recent book, Herscht 07769, during my honeymoon just a couple of months ago, and I've read also Satantango and The Melancholy of Resistance, which are his two very classic late 80s very bleak novels, and they were also adapted into movies by Bellatar. And so I really think he's an interesting writer to have won the Nobel. And for those who've watched my most recent video about John Fosse, who knew that I would be talking about two Nobel Prize laureates back to back, both of which who published really long novels that are only a single sentence. And I think contrasting those styles of single sentence work really shows what Krasznahorkai really does interestingly and differently than Fosse. For those unfamiliar, Krasznahorkai is a Hungarian writer. He also, I think, has really strong connections to Germany, and I think he's lived some time in America, but his most recent novel is set in Germany and concerns the rising fascism across Europe, and I think it is an interesting exploration of how his themes have evolved since he first began. And this is a book that is, as I mentioned, one single sentence, and it basically follows a young man who is a orphan. He's very naive, but he's very strong, so he gets taken in by a local cleaner who is also leader of the local Nazi group. And he is not a nationalist, but he just sort of goes along because this man saved his life. And it follows his adventures, his misadventures, because he continually writes to Chancellor Angela Merkel. This is set a bit in the past about how the world is ending because he's misunderstood about quantum deterioration that his professor friend visits. So you have, I think, a really standard Krasznahorkai style, which is a really sort of bleak topic about rising fascism and violence. In fact, there's an immigrant couple which is killed, which sort of sets off a lot of the novel's plot. But you also have a lot of slapstick and humor and just about the stupidity of people, which we'll get into when we talk about his earlier novels. But of course, the biggest thing about Krasznahorkai is his style. In his earlier works, his sentences will sometimes only last for just a whole chapter, but they are unbroken. There is no paragraphs, and it becomes this overwhelming text. So when I talked about John Fosse's work and septology, those are broken up by paragraphs, and it's a very flowing, hypnotic state. But I wouldn't describe Krasznahorkai's writing as particularly hypnotic or lyrical. It's more a really interesting crawl through a labyrinth and crevices, and you find interesting grime and pockets and corners. You'll stick longer in one area, and it's really just like wending your way through something. And I think that makes it the perfect vehicle for the overwhelming world that Krasznahorkai seeks to depict, whether it is this quantum entanglement and this rising fascist forces in Herscht 07769, which is, by the way, is the street and postal code that our hero is writing from, or if it's just the bleakness of the world of Hungary and the collapse of the Soviet world that he depicts in his other novels. I was actually a little disappointed by this most recent work. I think stylistically it's one of the most interesting books that I've read, but I felt that Krasznahorkai didn't really delve particularly deep into the subjects that he was going into. There's a lot of humor and interest and depiction of themes which are very prevalent, I think, in the modern political world, but he doesn't dig into it in a really interesting way, as, say, one of my favorite books from last year, Mircea Cătărescu's Solenoid, which uses a magical realism to really discover this hidden grotesquerie underneath the city and really just goes whole hog and full out with his imagery that I think this more realistic view that Krasznahorkai takes sort of takes a lot of the edge off, particularly because it mostly feels like he's skimming along the surface. When we have our hero take on the fascists and become sort of a violent, vengeful force of nature, the symbolism becomes very sort of rote. He's followed by animals which depict a German eagle. It doesn't get particularly subtle in its themes. I think overall it is a good book just from its style and momentum, but I wasn't really penetrated by it as I was, for instance, by what I think a lot of people consider his best book, which is Melancholy of Resistance, which first came out in 1989. The book is interesting just on premise alone, where it follows a traveling circus which is coming to a small town, and they are carrying the carcass of a whale, Leviathan. Very, again, not particularly subtle imagery, but I think what Krasznahorkai does with this is more interesting because he flits around many more characters than he does in Herscht, and he really does something that I find interesting in all of his books, where he aligns a lot of the main action, where he will pick up before and after a really violent event or something really climactic, and he'll just follow the characters in the aftermath of something rather than making the violent action the very central premise of his work. Again, you have a very pure soul at the center of the narrative, and you're surrounded by strange characters of the prince, who's sort of the shadowy figure that we never learn much about, who runs the circus. There is a townswoman who's trying to take over the town, and all of these struggles for power and this beautiful human soul that is trapped within it, I think becomes a really central theme of him wrestling with modernity and the power struggles and the dehumanization that has so racked particularly Eastern Europe, through a lot of the modern century. There's a very beautiful symbol in the book where you have a guy who's tuning an old type of piano to an almost universal tuning of all the semitones to try to get it to get perfect music. But of course, when he creates this, it creates a discordant nature, because everything about the tuning of semitones in piano instruments is everything's a little off so that the whole flows better. And so trying to achieve that perfection just creates this discord and disharmony throughout everything. And I think that's really sums up a lot of Krasznahorkai's work. And just like in Herscht, the paragraphs, the sentences are just full pages and pages long. And I think that oppressiveness and that overwhelmingness of everything shifting forward really just lends itself to the style and the themes that he's wrestling with. I think my least favorite of his books is one of his most famous, which is Satantango, which was made into actually a really brilliant movie by Bellatar. It's like 7 or 8 hours long. It's a very bleak black and white portrait of poverty within a small town. Essentially, a Satan-like figure arrives in the town, stirs up the townspeople to go on a quest to find a new place, which is just as ruined as the other. And there's a lot of, again, slapstick sort of laughter at the foibles and weaknesses of the human mind, and everything starts and ends with a really bleak violence and despair. But in this book, I think Krasznahorkai is just starting to tease out something that he gets much more familiar with in Melancholy of Resistance. And here it's all centralized around a single character. The comedy is a lot more broad, and I don't think it is as successful or as mysterious and as intriguing that I found what really worked with Melancholy of Resistance. So I think the movie works a bit better because you have the images and the slowness to back it up, whereas the book just becomes almost a relatively rote depiction of despair in Eastern Europe at the close of the Soviet era. So what would I say about Krasznahorkai winning the prize? Unlike with Han Kang last year, there isn't like a completely standout work that I consider one of the greatest, most interesting novels, which is Han Kang's Human Acts, which, if you haven't read it, is this really beautiful, chopped up depiction of the legacy of trauma told through a second person narrative where she puts you in the body and mind of people who have survived or have perished in this university massacre in South Korea in 1980. Just follows the trauma throughout generations. Fascinating. So if you're looking to get into Krasznahorkai, I would actually recommend his most recent book as his most accessible, even if I don't think you're getting the full Krasznahorkai experience, which has quite a bit more darkness to it. And I think Melancholy of Resistance is definitely, if you want to get the Krasznahorkai out of what I've read, that's definitely a way to go. You should also check out Bellatar's movies, because I think he really melds his form in a similar way to the text that Krasznahorkai does. But for me, Krasznahorkai's win is more of a testament to how interesting his style is than his subject matter. I think if I really wanted to go with someone I found much more interesting, it would be Mircea Cătărescu's Solenoid, which I already talked about. Someone that I think really just digs into the powers of the fiction to go into a really weird world rather than just go through a really weird text, which I think is beautiful in its own way, but not as satisfying for me in the end as some work that might have a bit more depth than I got from Krasznahorkai. But again, this is completely my own opinion. I know when I talked about John Fosse, how I didn't get a lot out of Sectology, there were some people that really did. So again, literature is so subjective, and I think these conversations are really intriguing to see what hits for different people. So if you have read some of Krasznahorkai's work, particularly the ones that I have not read, I think War on War people have talked about, as well as Baron Werkmester's Harmonies. Please let me know in the comments if they are substantially different or interesting, because he is someone who does seem to reiterate and change his work a little bit despite orbiting the same themes and using that same very overwhelming style, which is just sort of like getting caught, it feels like, in a flow of black magma. So please let me know in the comments as well. Everything is open for discussion. we really want to engage with literature. Nobel Prize winning literature is always a plus. And it's nice to see the Nobel Committee going with someone who has such an interesting style and something that is not a particularly rewarding experience thematically because it is just so bleak and depressing a lot of the times. But I would like to see them change a bit. They seem to be doing this weird alternation of male, female, and I'd like to see some more African Nobel laureates, South American laureates moving forward, just because I find those are a bit underrepresented as far as we go. But until next time, please let me know if you've read some Krasznahorkai. If you have something similar that you might think I like, if I do like Solenoid and Carter Rescue, please leave it in the comments because we can always keep adding to our reading list. And as always, I will talk to you soon about more interesting books and hopefully something a bit more positive next time. Talk to you soon. But Krasznahorkai, just like Kong, I think has a theme that he revisits again and again. In Kong's case, it's the legacy of trauma and revisiting that in an interesting ways. We Do Not Part, I quite liked. Vegetarian, a bit less so, but I think Human Ox stands out the most. And I think with Krasznahorkai, Melancholy of Resistance stands out the most just because it's the weirdest, and that tends to be what I like. I like weird fiction, I like horror, so for me, that was my preference, but I think his style is really just overwhelming combined with the bleak themes. I think is a really good melding of how to go about really creating an emerging style. Even if I don't think his most recent novel really digs in as deep as it could, stylistically, it's one of the most impressive and easy reads that I've read recently.